Mike has a number of publications, and upcoming ones include The American Serviceman, Finding and Recreating Jewish Community During World War II, in a very interesting series, which has the unusual name of Michael, on the history of the Jews in the diaspora. And this is published by the Goldstein-Gorin Diaspora Research Center at Tel Aviv University. Mike has also appeared in the PBS documentary film, GI Jews, Jewish Americans in World War II. His writing regularly appears in the Jewish Veteran magazine, which you might like to learn more about, and in the museum's website. Mike has some other interests, which are quite fascinating. In addition to his work at the museum, he hosts and produces the Uncensored History of the Blues podcast, and it's for the Delta Blues Museum in Clarksdale, Mississippi. He has appeared on radio programs and podcasts to discuss American music. Mike is a local boy. He was raised in Reston, Virginia. He earned his bachelor's degree in history from the College of William and Mary and a master's degree in museum studies from George Washington University. He lives in Dunloring, Virginia, with his wife, Judy, and his 9-year-old daughter, Hadley. And now, Mike, the screen is yours.
Thanks, Mindy, and thanks to the Jewish Studies Center for having me. It's always a pleasure to do things with the JSC folks. I'm glad to be here tonight. Let me get my screen up here. So the Civil War, World War I, and World War II all follow periods of large immigration, and specifically Jewish immigration. Which means that there are a lot of young Jewish men that have just come to this country that end up in the military, and putting on a uniform and starting to follow orders is about the most rapid Americanization process that anyone can undergo. And we see this before the Civil War and up to the present, but I'm going to talk tonight about those three major wars: Civil War, World War I, and World War II. The Civil War, we're talking about immigrants that come from Germany and other parts of Central Europe. Some of it as a response to these failed revolutions that were across Europe in 1848. World War I, we're talking about these Eastern Europeans from the Russian Empire. A lot of them come to escape pogroms, or specifically some come to avoid oppression in the form of the brutal military service that was a part of the Russian Empire. And in World War II, I'm going to be a little more specific, and I'm talking specifically about Jewish refugees who escaped Nazi Germany and came to this country and ended up in the military. So starting with the Civil War, 1850 to 1860 is a huge period for German-speaking Europeans coming to the U.S. And so when you get to this, and even more in the last decade or so leading right up to the Civil War, and so when you get to the Civil War, 25% of the Union Army is foreign-born, German-speaking new Americans. A lot of them were motivated to come here by these revolutions of 1848. So in 1848, there were these revolutions across Europe, people calling for democracy, calling for various forms of freedoms for the people. And so these are in France, the Netherlands, Italy, Austria, and the various states of what then made up the German Confederation. All these revolutions are crushed. The monarchies take back control. And so for these people that were calling for democracy, one logical thing to do was to come here, come to the United States, come to a democracy. And that happened in large numbers. And in terms of the Civil War, it's a lot more of a northern phenomenon than it is a southern one, but some come to the south as well. But a lot of them are coming to the north, coming to the northeastern cities that have had huge population growth. The early 19th century, the larger Jewish populations are in places like Charleston and Savannah. By the time you get to the Civil War, New York, Philadelphia are huge cities filled with Jews and with Jewish immigrants. So some of these become well-known military men in the Civil War. There's a few I'm not going to talk about, like Adolf Proskauer was hailed as a military hero in Alabama. He was a German immigrant. Marcus Spiegel in Ohio was killed in Vicksburg, Mississippi, part of what was called the Red River Campaign. There was a brigadier general, a breveted brigadier general named Frederick Neffler, who was a veteran of the 1848 wars in Europe. And one thing that the 48 revolutions gave was military experience to these Jews. So when they come to America, very few Americans of any kind really had military service going into the Civil War. And so those that had participated in the 48 revolution and fought in battles there were a valuable commodity to primarily the Union Army, but the Southern as well. I'm going to start with a Confederate figure. This is Philip Whitlock, or I should more properly say it might be Philip Whitlock. The arrow is pointing to a man who is sometimes identified as Philip Whitlock. In other analysis of this same photo, some people say it's somebody else entirely. But this is a very interesting photo that I'll get back to in a minute. So I wanted to share it, whether or not that it is Whitlock himself. The picture is of the Richmond Grays. But Philip Whitlock left Russian-occupied Poland in 1854. He was age 16 from a town called Wacławek, and his name, the last name Whitlock, seems to be a corruption of the name of that town. His name got changed from the town name. He has a kind of a harrowing escape from Poland. He has to go through multiple cities. He has to, he's bribing people. He finally makes his way initially to New York, but he has a brother in Richmond, Virginia. His brother is a tailor in Richmond, and so he ends up going there. And it's worth describing Whitlock's first encounter with the slave trade. So he's exposed to slavery for the first time, and he writes about this in a memoir he wrote many decades later. That man sold for $2,300. I left after that and never had any desire to go there again. Although it was novel to me, still, my feeling of humanity was such that I did not approve of the traffic. Yet there were a good many people who were respectful and in good standing that were engaged in the business. Some were Jews. So Whitlock pretty quickly adopts a Southern way of life, including basically all aspects of it. And so in 1859, he joins a local militia, the state militia known as the Richmond Grays, and they had been around Richmond for a long time. So Whitlock volunteers to join this militia. And when writing about why he did it, he talked about patriotism. And he said he thought it would be a good way of improving my health and get me in among men. So he wanted to fit in with the men of Richmond, Virginia, and military service was a way to do that, to fit in, to be one of the guys. And so membership in the Grays really put him in the mainstream of these young Virginia males. Okay, now I'm going to get back to this photo. This photo is not a Civil War photo. It's actually from 1859. And it was taken at the hanging of John Brown at Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. So John Brown, the militant abolitionist who had tried to rise up in West Virginia, the Richmond Grays are called in to put down John Brown's rebellion, to be a part of those forces, but they get there late. It's already basically over. But there, and this picture comes up a lot, and I think it's probably mostly because that fellow in the middle is such a compelling face. His name was Robert Alexander Caskey. But as people have done more research into this picture, they identified another person in there. And if you'll see, the second arrow came up there. That is John Wilkes Booth. But John Wilkes Booth had joined the Richmond Grays and gone to John Brown's hanging. Whitlock described being with John Wilkes Booth at the hanging of John Brown. I was very much surprised to see John Wilkes Booth, who was then acting in the Marshall Theater in a Richmond Gray uniform. So Booth had joined the company specifically to accompany them to John Brown's execution. And Whitlock stood next to John Brown, as they witnessed Brown's body hanging from the tree, hanging from the gallows, Whitlock noticed that John Wilkes Booth got very pale. He said, I called his attention to it. He said that he felt very faint and that he would give anything for a good drink of whiskey. So it's just to show you that in 1859, it didn't seem out of place for a immigrant Polish Jew to be amongst the Southern Cross's strongest devotees, men like Booth. And they would confide in a Jew like Whitlock, and he was one of them. There was no question about it. So Whitlock was still a member of the militia when war is declared and Virginia joins the Confederate forces, and the Grays are made the 1st Virginia Regiment. He talks about his decision to enter the war in his memoir. While I was very patriotic and I loved the country of my adoption, being a full-fledged citizen, I was ready for its rights, especially since I was of the Jewish faith. I thought if I was negligent in my duty as a citizen of this county, it would unfavorably reflect on the entire Jewish race and religion. And that's the kind of quote we see throughout the entire history of Jews in the American military. So Whitlock's military service during the war ends up not being particularly exciting. He's working in hospitals. He's in the Quartermaster Corps for a time, acquiring uniforms. He spends much of the war in Norfolk, Virginia. One thing that starts to happen as the war turns against the South and things are starting to fall apart is these Jews who fit in very well start to become a scapegoat for things going wrong. And one thing that gets associated is people are very upset in Richmond about people running the blockade to buy goods in the North and bring them back to the South and sell it at a profit. It's viewed as a very unpatriotic thing, that they're giving money to the North and they're profiting for themselves rather than helping their cause. There's an oft-quoted memoir by a Richmond woman named Sally Putnam, and she wrote, blockade running was extensively practiced by the Jews of Richmond, as well as by others whose nationality, purely Southern, ought to have encouraged expectations of more decided patriotism than was exhibited by them in their insane desire to grow rich. So what you see as the war effort starts to go bad, a lot of the centuries-old anti-Semitic stereotypes that you saw in Europe start to be applied to these Southern Jews, and they're fitting in a little less well. And actually Whitlock's brother at this point leaves Richmond and tries to go and goes to New York for the end of the war because they were experiencing so much anti-Semitism. Whitlock himself stays in Richmond, but he actually engages in these blockade running activities, he himself. So I usually try to talk about stories that defy stereotype. In this case, Whitlock was reinforcing these Jewish stereotypes. He had got he was on leave from the Confederate Army. He goes north in a very dangerous adventure. If he's caught in the North, he'll be arrested. If he's caught back home, he could be court-martialed, potentially executed. But he goes with a partner, and they go and buy these goods. They come back through Maryland. They make their way back to Richmond, and they actually do get caught. But rather than court-martial, the officers who catch him just end up taking all their stuff and selling it themselves. So Whitlock ends up with no profit, but fortunately for him, does not end up with the court-martial or any trouble. Other historians have looked into it, and they said there was not a particularly high rate of Jewish participation in these kind of activities, but seeing that Whitlock himself did, it's just an interesting thing to think about, the way he reinforced this stereotype as the anti-Semitism is rising. He stays in Virginia after the war, and he actually invents a cigar. He becomes a Virginia tobacco guy, kind of the ultimate Virginia occupation, called the Virginia cheroot. So Whitlock had a John Brown connection. This guy does as well. August Bondy. August Bondy was born in Vienna, Austria. He was a veteran of those 48 revolutions. But when the revolutions were crushed, he comes to the U.S. and after arriving in St. Louis, ends up in a place called Pottawatomie Creek in Franklin County, Kansas. He's immediately attracted to the abolitionist cause as Kansas is fighting to be a free state. These are what they call the Bleeding Kansas battles of the 1850s. And he begins to work with John Brown. He actually gets connected to John Brown because his cattle farm is right next to that of the Brown family. And the Brown's cows wander on to August Bondi's farm. And that's how he ends up getting to know these John Brown and his sons. So he ends up being very involved, fighting in all of these Bleeding Kansas battles of the 50s. And so when it came time for the Civil War, he enlists and ends up joining the 5th Kansas Cavalry. The quote you see on the screen here is from his autobiography. My mother said that as a Yehudi, I had the duty to perform, to defend the institutions which gave equal rights to all beliefs. My wife was still pregnant. Then my mother rose up and said she would care for and protect and work for and do all she could for my wife and child. I must go and fight for my country, and she would care for family and home. And my mother has faithfully, most faithfully, redeemed the pledge. When I left home, November 26, 1861, I left my family with some 30 head of cattle, 1 yoke of work oxen, 11 cows, the balance young stock, 1 mare, and 2 spring coats, also some pigs. So Bondi serves with the 5th Kansas Cavalry through the war. He's actually wounded 3 times in the Civil War. And he ends up settling in a place called Salina, Kansas, after the war, where he becomes the town's postmaster, and then he later becomes a county judge. This is Frederick George Deotassi, a fascinating and controversial and mysterious figure. He had served actually initially in the Austrian army in the 1840s, but when the revolution breaks out in 1848, the Hungarian Revolution in this case, he joins the revolutionaries and serves with the Hungarian army. He comes to the U.S. with his brothers. His brothers Anthony and Carl served as officers with him in the 39th New York Infantry, what's called the Garibaldi Guard. He is, as a man with military experience, essentially given the responsibility of forming the 39th New York Infantry. And Garibaldi is the name of an Italian general that Deotassi had served with. The regiment is incredibly diverse. People from all over the world had come and joined this New York regiment, as New York City had become a center for immigration. So the 39th New York Infantry had 11 companies initially, and they were divided into 3 German, 3 Hungarian, 1 Swiss, 1 Italian, 1 French, 1 Spanish, and 1 Portuguese. And Deotassi had the responsibility of getting this together. And apparently, initially, it was a mess. It was very difficult to get these men together. All these different languages being spoken, and there's very little opportunity to organize. What he decides to do is he bans orders being given in any other language than English. He also bans alcohol amongst the men. And apparently it works. It works in a military sense, and he gets the regiment together, and they have some successes. And he's praised as a really successful military man, but a lot of the men are angry at him. And there's a real split in the regiment of whether he is a hero or just someone that is destroying the lives of the men who serve under him. He is eventually court-martialed for stealing horses. He's accused of unlawfully selling and disposing of government horses for his own benefit. And this story ends up getting taken up in the media, particularly the New York newspapers. And there's a real firestorm back and forth about whether this guy is a hero or a villain. In these articles about him, he is accused of not being this military general with all these experience in Austria and Hungary. They say, in fact, he was a European secondhand clothes dealer, a Jew named Strasser. And when I first came across this story, it was presented that he probably was not Jewish, but he was just, that was their way of attacking him, saying, hey, this guy's just a Jew. But then researchers have done a lot of work into his family. It's pretty clear he was Jewish, and there was some accuracy to this reporting that his name was Strass when he was in Hungary. But he took a new name, as many do when he got to this country, Tassi. And he ends up convicted of that horse stealing and ends up in Sing Sing prison, and connected to his decision to not let other languages be spoken. The line when he arrives at Sing Sing prison was that he says to the guard, I speak 12 and hear much of it. Tassi ends up dying in the strange explosion in a Baltimore hotel room. I want to talk now about the first Jewish chaplains in the U.S. military come during the Civil War, and a lot of it is connected to these immigrant soldiers. The guy on the left that you see there is Michael Mitchell Allen, who is not an immigrant. He's born in Philadelphia in 1830, and he's serving with the 65th Regiment of the 5th Pennsylvania Cavalry, which is made up of a lot of Philadelphia men and a lot of Jews. It's not exclusively Jewish, all kinds of people in there, but it's a highly Jewish unit. And apparently by just the nature of his personality, that he was a teacher, that he liked to talk about religion, he begins acting as the regimental chaplain. And one of his sermons that was recorded, he kind of describes, he gets at why. He says to the men, there are many of you who are good and loyal adopted citizens of this, our country. And as there are amongst you those not very well conversant with the English language, I wish you to consider me as your teacher. And during your leisure hours in camp, should you wish to perfect yourself in the vernacular language of this country, I will be glad and willing to impart all the necessary information with my time and abilities permit. So he is acting as the chaplain for this group when a representative of the YMCA sees what's happening. And this YMCA representative objects to him being a chaplain. The law specifically states you have to be a recognized minister of Christian faith to be a chaplain in the U.S. Army. Allen met none of those. He's not Christian. He's not even a recognized minister. He was not a rabbi. He was just a guy with religious faith and with a lot of knowledge, which is fine in Jewish tradition, but not under the law of what defines who can be a chaplain. He decides to resign as chaplain. He submits a resignation, says he doesn't want to deal with it. But then they select another Jew to be the new chaplain, a rabbi named Arnold Fischel, who was born in the Netherlands, and he was going to be Allen's successor. He doesn't end up serving as chaplain either, but what he does do is begin the fight to allow Jewish chaplains. And it ends up, the appeal goes all the way up to Abraham Lincoln himself, and he urges Congress to change the law, which they do. They change it from having to be of Christian faith to being a recognized official of some religion. And so there end up being 3 official Jewish chaplains in the Union Army during the Civil War. All of them are immigrants. Jacob Frankel was German-born. He's the first officially appointed Jewish chaplain. He serves as a hospital chaplain. Ferdinand Sarner was born in Lisa, Germany, which I guess is now in Poland. And he was known as the Rabbi of Gettysburg. He served as a regimental chaplain there. He was actually wounded at Gettysburg, Rabbi Sarner. And the third was Bernard Henry Goodhelf, a native of Bavaria, who was living in Louisville, Kentucky. And he serves as a hospital chaplain as well during the war. And interestingly, in the years after the war, Goodhelf ends up going down south, and he serves as the first Reform rabbi in Vicksburg, Mississippi, in a couple a decade or so after the war. All right, I want to move on to World War I. So these Eastern Europeans are leaving the Russian Empire, often specifically to avoid military service there. And one thing that happens is the Congress passes a law creating an expedited citizenship process for those serving in the military. So that's an important factor for these young Jewish immigrants who are coming to this country who want to be citizens. Another important thing in the First World War is the formation of the Jewish Welfare Board. So that's the morale organization that's created to specifically deal with Jewish service members. So back to the YMCA. The YMCA had been the morale organization for the entire military, but it was a proselytizing Christian organization. So Jews and Catholics as well object to the YMCA doing this for everyone. And it ends up being the Knights of Columbus take over that responsibility for Catholics, and the Jewish Welfare Board is created as a new organization to do it for Jews. So they're the organization that manages chaplains in the military. They build these huts and all the camps that have sprung up as part of the huge buildup for the war effort. And one of their responsibilities, one of their reasons for existing is to Americanize these foreign-born troops. That's part of their reason for being. The Russian Revolution is an important thing to consider as well, with these Americans had left Russia entering the war. Prior to Tsar Nicholas being overthrown or resigning, depending on how you look at it, if these American Jews had to pick a side, they essentially were Germans against the Russians. But the Revolution changes that, and it really opens the door for willing Jews to join the U.S. Army who would come from Russia. This is a picture of the Jewish Welfare Building at Camp Gordon in Georgia. So this is one of the huts that the Jewish Welfare Board created on these new camps. The Camp Gordon plan created what was called a foreign soldiers subsection. And what it did was it kind of the opposite of what we talked about with U.S.to. Rather than trying to train everyone in English, they decided to provide military instruction in the native languages of all the men. So that was in all kinds of language, and Yiddish was one of them. So that was first formed at Camp Gordon, and it was adopted at these various camps across the country. This is from Camp Upton in New York. So Camp Upton was on Long Island, and that is a Christmas time newspaper. And these newspapers were published. They were joint efforts of the camps and the local newspapers. So if you look at the bottom, that one is season's greetings in Yiddish. And I got to say, I don't know what it says, but maybe if there's some better Yiddish readers than me on there, you can let us know a little bit later. But the Jewish Welfare Board, they do things like help with getting Yiddish for instruction, but they also, as purveyors of the idea that these men should become more American, have to make certain decisions. So there's a battle over whether there should be kosher food served at Camp Upton. And essentially, JWB decides that's not a battle worth pursuing, that these men have to be American in ways like everyone else. So they get Yiddish instruction, but they decide not to fight for kosher food. So amongst those that trained at Camp Upton is the 77th Division, made up of men from New York, so a huge number of Jews, huge number of immigrants training at Upton. They include Jack Hershkowitz, who was born in Romania, and Abraham Krotoshinsky, who was from Russia. They were both what was called, part of what was called the Lost Battalion, which had some degree of fame in the First World War. They were fighting in Germany, and they kind of essentially advanced too far, and they're surrounded on three sides and enclosed basically by Germans in every direction. Hershkowitz and Krotoshinsky were both men that managed to get messages through back to headquarters, which was the main issue. They weren't able to they weren't able to communicate with headquarters. They were running out of food. Supplies were not available to get to these men. So they were both awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military honor that you can receive. I'll read you Hershkowitz's citation. Near Binarville, France, 29 September 1918. In order to obtain ammunition and rations, Private Hershkowitz, with another soldier, accompanied an officer in an effort to reestablish communication between battalion and regimental headquarters. They were attacked by a small party of Germans, but drove them off, killing one. When night came, they crawled unknowingly into the center of a German camp, where they lay for 3 hours undetected. Finally discovered, they made a dash to escape. In order to protect the officer, Private Hershkowitz deliberately drew the enemy fire to himself, allowing the officer to escape. Private Hershkowitz succeeded in getting through. So that's, I think, more people. If we had done this a year ago, I suspect not that many people would have remembered, decided with World War I, that they were going on at the same time. More people are probably aware of that now as we go through our own pandemic. But Hershkowitz had the flu as he was doing all this. His temperature, he said, reached 105 degrees as he was dealing with these Germans and trying to break through to get these messages through to get supplies back to the men in the lost battalion. The lost battalion became well known in part because of a 1919 movie, a Hollywood film directed by Burton King. And Burton King actually got the men who had participated in these battles to go back the next year and reenact it. That was kind of the catch of the film, that these are the real guys in this Hollywood movie. So just a year later, he has them all participate, and Hershkowitz and Krotoshinsky are both amongst them. So I'm going to show you guys some clips, the Jewish highlights of the Lost Battalion film of 1919. And this is a silent film, so if you can't hear anything, that is right. That's what you're supposed to hear. So this is Hershkowitz being introduced at the beginning, and then Krotoshinsky. And that is the Distinguished Service Cross Medal that's being held by the off-screen hand. So this is the scene that was in the beginning part of the movie, in the build-up before the battle. In what's kind of become a war movie cliche, they show all these men of different and diverse backgrounds getting together, forming a unit, and becoming one American unit, as opposed to a bunch of different ethnic backgrounds. It's become a trope that's in many war movies, but this is one of the earlier ones. And so this is the scene of the Jewish family, and you see the generational difference between the parents and the son who's going to be the one going off to war. So they do this in the film with a Chinese family, with some Italian families, and with some wealthier, rich businessmen who try to get out of the war, but the son refuses. And this is the Jewish scene. Because they've lived up to the traditions of the American soldier. So this is where it comes together. This is from the end of the movie. These guys are no longer thought of as being foreign-born or being immigrants. These are the American soldiers. And that's a reenactment of Hershkowitz receiving the Distinguished Service Cross, and then we'll see the same thing for Krotoshinsky. So when Krotoshinsky wrote about his experiences, he was one of the ones that was very explicit that he said, I ran away from Russia and came to America to escape military service. I hated Russia, particularly its cruel and inhuman treatment of Jews. And that difference between the attitude towards military service in Russia and military service in America is really a telling, important thing. Oh, and that's the last part that snuck in here, that I don't think that's actually accurate that they gave a Distinguished Service Cross to Cher Ami. Cher Ami was a pigeon who also got messages through to headquarters and became more famous than any of the men. But Krotoshinsky and others were fairly well known at the time. Krotoshinsky, interestingly, in the 20s, goes to Palestine to work in the farm program. It's farm program for the people of Israel. So during the war, in the year after, he's kind of hailed as a hero. But in the 20s, there's really a lot of rising anti-Semitism. I think that's what causes him to leave the country for several years to work on this farm program in Palestine before he actually does come back to New York, and he worked in the post office for the remainder of his life. This is Sam Drebin, who was known as the Fighting Jew. He came to the U.S. at age 18 in 1899 and immediately joins the army and goes off to fight in the Philippine-American War, sometimes called the Philippine Insurrection. Then he fights in the Boxer Rebellion in China. He fights on the Mexican border, and then he fights again in World War I. He was also a Distinguished Service Cross recipient. And he became somewhat well known when the famed newspaper columnist Damon Runyon wrote a poem about Drebin after Drebin had died. And I'll go ahead and read Runyon's poem. Hail Drebin, there's a story in that paper I just tossed upon the floor that speaks of prejudice against the Jews. There's a photo on the table that's a memory of the war. And a man who never figured in the news. There's a cross upon his breast that's the DSC, Distinguished Service Cross, the Croix de Guerre, the Militaire, these two. And there's a heart beneath the medal that beats loyal and true. That's Drebin, the Jew. Now, whenever I read articles that breathe of racial hate or hear arguments that hold his kind to scorn, I always see that photo with the cap upon his pate and the nose the size of Bugler Dugan's horn. I see upon his breast the DSC, the Croix de Guerre, the Militaire, these two, and I think, thank God Almighty, we have more than a few like Drebin, a Jew. Drebin kind of came to be recognized as the ultimate soldier, as you see in Runyon's poem, praising his bravery, all the medals he won, and also getting in a little shot about the size of his nose. I wanted to include this last one. This is Harry Dodick, who was a Washington, D.C. area guy, came as a child from Russia. And this is just one of these things that shows that he was one of the guys. So his buddies presented this to him as he was on his way home, that in his, on the eve of the last night in France, he did very well in the Battle of Cognac, and as this war was presented by General Hennessy. So that's just to show Dodick as a guy who absolutely fit in with the others. So when we get into World War II, a huge number of foreign-born individuals are serving in the U.S. Army. Again, there is expedited citizenship for those serving in the military. You can become a citizen significantly faster as a member of the military. Though Germans, Japanese, and Italian, people that come from those countries, as well as people that just had some ancestry from those countries, were sometimes dubbed enemy aliens. And all these immigrants from Germany would have been dubbed enemy aliens. There was a friendly enemy alien category. But the 1940 Selective and Service Training Act, which is the act that established the draft, the first peacetime draft, specifically stated that enemy aliens were eligible for military service and that they had to register for the draft. So initially, the enemy alien status had meant you couldn't join the military. That changes in 1940, and it opens things up for a lot of these German refugees, and a lot of them are really hoping to get into the war. And there's so many of these stories. A lot of them, Aufbau was a German language newspaper that published a regular feature called Our Boys in the Army that talked about how all these Germans in the American Army were doing. So I'm just going to share a few brief ones. Try to show you some things that I find interesting, but this is, not comprehensive in any way to show the experience of all these Germans in World War II. I wanted to start with Karl Hyman. We always talk about the Jews that came from Germany and went back to Europe to fight. But early in the war, there seems to have been a tendency using that enemy alien classification to send German refugees to the Pacific rather than back to Europe, because using the standard thought process, but they obviously incorrect that the Germans might not want to fight against their native country, when in fact many of these German Jews really wanted to do exactly that. So Karl Hyman is sent off to the Pacific. He was the son of a World War I hero, a German World War I hero, an Iron Cross recipient. And being the son of a World War I hero had allowed him to stay in German school system for longer than most other Jewish students. That was one aspect of the Nuremberg laws. So he is still in the German school system until 1938, until Kristallnacht. And after that, that's when it's completely over for everyone, World War I hero or not. His family does come to the U.S. They come with very few things in the way of possessions. But one thing they do have, they do manage to bring a Torah with them, a Torah that had been commissioned in Vienna in 1871 and had been stored in Oberdorf, Germany before the war, and then finally come to the US with the Hyman family. And that actually becomes the Torah in the chaplain at Fort Dix in New Jersey. The Hyman family Torah becomes the Fort Dix Torah. Carl Hyman saw a lot of action in the Pacific. He was wounded. He received the Purple Heart. He was highly decorated. He was among the first Americans who saw Hiroshima after the nuclear bombing. And Hyman spoke a lot about his experiences. He was, very sure that dropping the nuclear bomb had been the right thing to do. And he was actually quite proud that the production of the first nuclear bomb had been such a Jewish effort. So Hyman achieved a lot in the Pacific, but as the war progresses, the military really begins to recognize how valuable the Jewish German refugees can be. They recognize, these were the most motivated soldiers imaginable, and that they were particularly valuable for intelligence work. They know the culture of Germany, and they know the language, they know the geography, they know the people. Henry Kissinger is probably the most famous example of a German refugee who comes. He's actually serving with a regular infantry unit in Europe when he's pulled into intelligence work, and that happens with a lot of these Germans in the American Army. At Camp Ritchie, which was in Maryland, near Hagerstown, they opened the Military Intelligence Training Center in 1942. And there's some good stuff that you can see and read about Camp Ritchie. There's a documentary film called The Ritchie Boys that tells a lot of these stories, and a good book by a guy named Bruce Henderson called Sons and Soldiers. Just a couple months ago, a memoir of a Ritchie boy by the name of Guy Stern was published. It's called Invisible Ink. And Guy Stern talks a lot about how, he really understood the German psyche and did things after he's trained as a POW interrogator, which is one of the main things they do at Camp Ritchie. They train men on how to interrogate POWs and gain intelligence that way. So Guy Stern has a lot of stories, and he talks about finding the right balance of when you wanted to scare these German prisoners, when you wanted to try to be their friend. He created a character. He would play a character of this Russian admiral, and he thought the Germans were more scared of Russians than Americans. And these guys that were trained at Camp Ritchie end up interrogating their former neighbors, and it's really extraordinary. There's a powerful quote from a guy named Martin Selling, who was trained as a POW interrogator, and he's interviewing a German prisoner during the war, and the Germans ask him, wow, how did you learn to speak such good German? And his response was, I learned how to speak German in Germany, and I learned how to interrogate prisoners while I was a prisoner in Dachau. And he said the response of this German, after realizing that he had been in Dachau before coming to the US and before joining the army, made him realize he was in big trouble, and he started talking. And it's very significant that these men going back to Germany are returning in power. There's no victimhood for these guys. It's a completely different experience than it would have been for them as a European Jew. So a lot of really powerful stories come out of Camp Ritchie and these men that go back to Europe. Another guy who went back to Europe was Harry Ettlinger. He was born in Karlsruhe, Germany in 1926. His family flees Germany September 25th, 1938, the day after Harry's bar mitzvah. The Ettlinger family comes here. He gets trained by the army, and he's actually expecting to go into intelligence work when he receives a different order to join this Fine Arts Commission. So for folks that have read the Monuments Men book, you know about Harry Ettlinger. He figures highly in that book. And if you've seen the Monuments Men movie, there's a character named Sam Epstein in that. It's based on Harry's story. So he ends up in what they call the Heilbronn salt mines, which is where this picture was. And he goes through the artwork that they had stored down there, and that some had been hidden, some of it was stolen, some of it had just been removed from art museums. So as a child living under the Nuremberg laws, Harry Ellinger had grown up 3 blocks from an art museum that he was not allowed to visit as a Jew. Jews were expressly forbade from using these Germany's cultural institutions. So he ends up going through these master works of art in the middle of these salt mines that he wasn't even allowed to see. He passed away a few years ago. Kurt Klein is another one some of you guys may be aware of. One of probably the single most significant role that American Jews, where the Judaism becomes relevant, and as well as German immigrant American Jews play in the war is as liberators of concentration camps. Some of these men go back and as they liberate the camps, they end up finding their own families. Kurt Klein is classified as a liberator. He doesn't come on a camp, but he's a guy from Waldorf, Germany. Talks about growing up in Germany, not even knowing that there was a distinction between being Jewish and being German. He was just a German, period. But everything changes. He comes to Europe, returns. It's an American soldier with the 5th Infantry Division. He comes across a building. Inside the building are 120 women. So they had been marched there by their SS guards, but the SS had abandoned them. So these women are by themselves in this building. He discovers about 24 of these women are actually dead. They'd taken them on a forced march from a camp in Grunberg in Germany. And he comes upon a woman. She's down to 68 pounds, described as a walking skeleton. And he speaks to her in German. They talk, and she says, "We are Jewish, you know." And his reply was, "So am I." And she would later say, "It was the most incredible experience of my life to be liberated, not only by an American, but by a fellow Jew." Her name was Gerda Weitzman. She'd been born in Poland. And a year later, she becomes Gerda Weitzman Klein. The two of them get married in Paris. And she ends up writing books, and there's an HBO documentary about her experiences. So just as one kind of first effort to kind of recreate some kind of Jewish community that you see when these survivors are discovered by the men of the American Army. I said I was going to do 3 wars, but I'm going to cheat a little bit and add a 4th war in there. This is Tibor Rubin. Tibor Rubin was liberated from Mauthausen concentration camp. He was there as a kid and as a teenager in concentration camps. He was born in Hungary. He decides after he's liberated by these Americans, he wants to come to the U.S. and join the army, which he does, and he serves in the Korean War. So Tibor Rubin, unfortunately, has some of the worst stories of anti-Semitism in the U.S. Army of anyone. And he has a sergeant who picks on him endlessly, who doesn't like him because he's a Jew, and not only is he a Jew, he's a Jew that speaks with this thick Hungarian accent, really stands out from the rest of the guys. So he's given, the responsibilities of whether it's cleaning the kitchen when it shouldn't have to be his turn, or actually in combat. And there's one particular time, the company, Rubin's company, his rifle company, is going to retreat, but he's ordered to stay in place as all the rest of the guys retreat. And Rubin's told, "You stay here by yourself. You hold off the enemy with all the rest of the company retreats." And he's essentially left there basically to die. But he does have multiple weapons. He takes a position on top of a hill, and he ends up in a 24-hour-long single-handed battle. He's fighting by himself against North Korean and Chinese. Eventually, later in the war, he's captured, ends up as a prisoner of war in a POW camp run by the Chinese. But as a kid who kind of grew up in concentration camps, he's a very skilled prisoner at this time in his life. And he's the guy who sneaks out, brings food back for all his buddies in the camp. He's the one that's learned some basic medical techniques, and he does things like he has maggots eat away at the dead flesh and these gangrenous wounds that are going untreated amongst the men he's imprisoned with. The Chinese offer him a chance to leave. He said he's originally Hungarian. That's now a communist country. They say he can go back to Hungary. Reuben says, no, I'm an American now. I'm not going to go back to Hungary. He ends up staying in this POW camp for way longer than he had to. Initially, because he had this anti-Semitic sergeant who would not recommend him for any awards. Nothing he did into this amazing 24-hour battle, single-handed battle, all the things he does in this POW camp, none of it is officially recognized. But so many people testify about all the things Tibor Rubin did that 50 years later, he was awarded the Medal of Honor based on a review and all this testimony about what he did, and he was alive to receive it and appreciate it. So that is all I've got. So I just wanted to show, these immigrants, once they're in the military, no longer necessarily among refugees. They're only people with a shared background that kind of become American quite quickly. And, this military experience is unlike almost any other American experience. And we see it throughout so many of these wars, I think, provides an interesting view into this process. So I think, Mindy, if we're ready, we can go ahead and
Mindy, you have to unmute.
Okay, we have a question that goes back to the photograph that you showed, Mike, about several people in the Civil War period. And the person is wondering what John Wilkes Booth had in his hand. She's asking if it was a spike. And I want.
Yeah, so let's see, I can get this back up here.
Yeah, that's right. Very good.
Your guess is as good as mine. It certainly looks, and I'm not sure. It's a little confusing whose arms are where.
Mm-hmm.
But it looks like they're holding out something in a aggressive manner, some kind of spike. But I don't have any more information on that.
Yeah, I had a feeling that that might remain unknown. Okay, let me ask a couple of other questions, and I encourage people to think about questions they would like to pose. You can either post them on chat, or we can later turn to you directly. In terms of the relationship between the soldiers who were not Jewish and their Jewish companions, you alluded to some anti-Semitic incidents, but what kind of memoirs do we have or other accounts? Let's take the time of World War I, for example. Do we have accounts of people recounting their experiences with other soldiers who were Catholic or Protestant, and how they perceived the Jews they served with, or memoirs of other soldiers talking about meeting Yiddish-speaking Jewish people for the first time?
Yeah, there is a fair number of those accounts, and there's a lot of stories of the type where the Jewish soldier is writing that somebody tells him, you're the first brave Jew I've ever met. And they say, oh, have you met a lot of Jews before? And they're like, no, you're the first Jew I've ever met. And there tends to be the coming together. I talked about it as a cliche in terms of the war movie, but it's real. And I think these folks that serve together genuinely learn about other cultures for the first time, and there are a lot of initial anti-Semitism, probably more. I mean, World War II, we're talking, the numbers are so big. Over 500,000 American Jews served in World War II, over 200,000 American Jews served in World War I. The Civil War, we're talking about much smaller numbers, 7,000, 8,000 in the north, 2,000 or 3,000 in the south. So there's There are a lot of memoirs written years later that recount initial acts of anti-Semitism that get overcome and end up in friendship.
Okay, well, we have a very interesting question from Susan Sachs, and it's directed to the following. She writes that her father helped liberate either Dachau or Buchenwald. That's not clear within their family, but she'd like to research this. She has his discharge papers, and she'd like to reconstruct what happened to him and those around him. And she's asking you, Mike, for what resources you could recommend to her.
Yeah. So if you do have his discharge papers, then you can get unit histories a lot of the time, and not always. But if you know what units he served with, there are unit histories that should describe, where they went. The Holocaust Museum has a lot of stuff about which units are considered liberating units, and I think they define liberators as in within 2 days of the initial liberation. So going from his unit information, you might be able to find it. You can't always, and not everything in the paperwork described everything that an individual saw. There are a couple books on liberaters. If we can send like a follow-up email, I can come up with some better sources than off the top of my head. But
okay, Elaine, you have a question.
No, I just wanted to mention that there is a Jewish general among us who may or may not speak up. He is in the third of 4 generations of service in the U.S. Army, the first one being one of the European immigrants. And I didn't know if he would speak, but maybe we'll hear from him because he's quite knowledgeable about, at least one of these chaplains.
Is he on this call?
Yes.
Elaine, could you identify him?
I think I'll leave it to him if he would like to identify himself. He has identified himself, but isn't unmuted. He's Lieutenant General retired Rick Hack.
If you want to raise your hand. And
he is raising it.
Where are you?
He's raising it.
I don't see him.
Rick Hack.
I think
I see him.
Okay.
Change to gallery view.
All right. Let's see. Rick Hack.
He can give you further information on Rabbi. Well, I'll let him.
I think you should be unmuted now, Rick.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. A very interesting talk, Michael. I was very fascinated. I would tell you on Jewish chaplains, I believe Chaplain Brigadier General David Zalis may have been the first general officer Jewish chaplain in the Army, Zalis. He made it, I think, around 2001 or 2002. Very significant because in the chaplaincy corps, there are never more than 3 generals in the Army, and so one of 3, they chose a Jewish chaplain, which was very unusual. Also, because you're from Virginia, Moses Ezekiel was a cadet. You probably know this, Mike, but
yeah.
For the others, Moses Ezekiel was a cadet at VMI, first Jewish cadet, marched 80 miles and fought at the Battle of Newmarket, was wounded, and later on became quite a well-known, internationally acclaimed sculptor.
Yeah, and Ezekiel did the Confederate Memorial that's in Arlington National Cemetery, so people can go.
As well as several art sculptures that were actually commissioned by the B'nai B'rith in Philadelphia.
Yeah, Moses Ezekiel. Yeah, he wrote a autobiography when I think he spent the last couple decades of his life in Italy.
Right.
And it's pretty fascinating. He was at the same time this continental European guy, but he was as firm a defender of like a lost cause ideology as anyone. So he writes a lot about Richmond during that period. And Philip Whitlock actually in his memoir mentions Ezekiel's brother as being in the Richmond graves with them. I forget. I think I'm trying to recall his name. I think he was something that I think he says something like Ezekiel. And I was like, it's probably a nickname, but I'm not. Who knows? But yeah, the story of the VMI cadets is one of the interesting Civil War stories, and Moses Ezekiel's a fascinating figure.
Yeah.
VMI does not have a long tradition of Jewish. I was the only graduating in my class. I was the only Jew, and in the school during my time, there were only 3 of us. So.
Okay, thank you very much. We really enjoy hearing these kind of personal discussions about people's experiences. We have Bruce Jank, who's raised his hand. Bruce, are you with us?
Hello?
Bruce?
We heard you for a
Bruce,
second.
you have to unmute. Bruce Jankowitz, please unmute yourself.
Okay,
There you go.
I believe I am. Thank you. Thank you for doing this, Michael. This was very interesting. Comment I want to make is one of the most fascinating stories of a Jewish soldier serving in World War II that I recently read about was a Lieutenant Jacob Besser, who was an electronic countermeasure specialist, and he flew on both the Enola Gay and Boxcar missions to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And his essential, I believe his job was for watching for any outside signals that could impact the bombs exploding earlier before impact. And he was so specialized in what he was doing, and it was so new at the time, that Colonel Paul Tibbets kept him out of all prior military action for fear he may go down on an earlier plane. And it was very fascinating. I read that recently in Chris Wallace's book, 1945, about the dropping of the bomb.
Yeah, I believe Besser was the only one that was on both of those.
That's correct, yes.
Okay, Shuli Carroll has a question which goes to the core of what Mike was talking about, and it is the following. Did military service help enhance these Jews who were immigrants, their experience and their Americanness during these periods? So serving in the American military, how or did this experience Americanize them in some way?
Yeah, I think it absolutely did. I think, it immediately instilled them with a sense of belonging to this country, and then that became their identity. Now that you don't lose your background, but there's putting on a uniform and following the same orders makes you one of the guys right away. And I think in all of these wars, particularly World War I and World War II, you really see that as a effective military service, as a very effective means of people feeling American.
Okay, we have a comment by Robert Braun, if he's still on the call here. He writes,
I'm here.
All right, why don't you speak to what you just sent in the chat?
Oh, sure. I was stationed in Naples, Italy, and David Zallis used to come and perform services for us several times. And when we traveled to Israel one time, we stayed at his apartment in Jerusalem. So Mazel Tov, I didn't realize he got such a high honor.
Okay. I want to go back to what we started out with, which was the Civil War. Mike, do you know any more about what chaplains actually did, some of their daily activities? You mentioned a bit about that. And I realize it's a long time ago and people didn't necessarily keep journals, but it would be interesting to see what else they tried to do with that role.
Yeah, Michael Mitchell Allen, who was the one who had to resign, was never an official chaplain. There are records of the sermons he gave to this regiment, and they're not particularly Jewish. They're religious in a general way. The hospital chaplains had, you could imagine what the job is there. The chaplaincy, going back to the Civil War, I don't know if this was, I guess, when we first started to develop the ecumenical idea of being for all the men, no matter what their religion. But it's really not till much later that becomes a fully fleshed thing, though you see the basics of it in those sermons. But they would offer prayer, they would offer comfort to the wounded, and they would hold regular services, religious services.
Okay, let me ask a little bit. This is going a little further afield, but I think it might be interesting. Say a bit more about the Jewish Welfare Board. Who is behind it? Who are the movers and shakers? And who supported it?
Yeah, so let me recommend a book on that first of all. Actually, I have it right here. This is Jessica Cooperman's book, Making Judaism Safe for America. And it's about the origins of the Jewish Welfare Board in World War I. There are, initially is some competition for who is going to be the Jewish organization that is the morale organization for the military. The YHCA is initially doing some of the work during the Mexican border campaign during 1915. It's an involved story, but eventually it's determined they want a whole new organization. A guy named Harry Cutler is a major figure in the development of the Jewish Welfare Board. That's a really complex question. But essentially, it's born because they need an organization, one, to certify who's allowed to be a Jewish chaplain in the military. There'd never been an organization for that before. The numbers are what dictates creating an organization for the first time. Over 200,000 American Jews in the military. So, what could be handled on an individual basis in earlier times now needs some organizational structure. There needs to be a national organization because these camps are all over the country now. And so even after the creation of the Jewish Welfare Board, when you see some of the stuff that's going on and some of the camps, they're bringing in local rabbis rather than having a chaplain, or the guys are doing it themselves. And there's some very interesting 1917 stories about how the Jewish holidays are celebrated on different camps. But it comes together a series of debates. I think I'm trying to remember the other organizations that were the key forces behind it, and I am drawing a blank at the moment, but it was an involved process with a lot of competing organizations before the Jewish Welfare Board emerges as this new organization.
Okay, that's helpful. And continuing to ask about the chaplains, Annie Baer, if I'm pronouncing it right, asked if the chaplains ever saw combat.
Yeah. I mean, going back to the Civil War, Rabbi Sarner saw combat at Gettysburg, and chaplains are not designed to be in combat, but they end up on the front lines. And the World War II story eventually exploding around Rosh Hashanah services and things like that. So they find their way there, even though it's not a combat role.
Okay, Aileen, did you have a question? I wasn't sure if you were raising your hand. Aileen? No? Okay. All right, we have a little time left. If anyone else would like to address a question to Mike or make a general comment, we welcome that. Jerry, are you raising your hand?
Let me make a little comment about the chaplains. Remember in World War II, the very famous situation where the ship went down and the two chaplains decided to go down with the ship rather than to leave. And one of the chaplains was Jewish. So that certainly is
Yeah,
in
so that's
combat.
the story of the 4 chaplains, and the rabbi was Alexander Good, who actually had been a rabbi at Washington Hebrew congregation.
Yes.
So they all decided to give up their life vests for the men. And there's a chapel of the 4 chaplains in Philadelphia that's worth checking out if you find yourself there.
Yeah, Rick Hack, you'd like to say something? Rick, unmute yourself.
Yeah, just on the chaplaincy, today, although it's a non-combat role of a chaplain, it does not mean that they are not on the front lines. For instance, Chaplain Zalas was the K4 chaplain during the Kosovo War. He was also in Desert Storm, I believe, and so non-combat role just means he didn't carry a weapon, but he certainly was in danger. And just one other thing, in terms of integration into society and moving up in society after serving in the military, as my cousin Elaine exposed me, I will tell you that my grandfather was a cook during World War I. My father entered the Army as a private, sent to the Pacific, came back to OCS and fought in some of the major tank battles in Germany. When he finished with his career, he retired as a full colonel and was 51st Regimental Commander of the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment. We only have 2 or 3 cavalry regiments in the armed forces. And my son was a West Point graduate and served 8 years in the Army and 13 months in Iraq as an infantry platoon leader.
That's just fascinating. This is so rich when people share some of their own life histories. We've recorded this, so if you want to go back and listen to some of the things we've been learning in the past 20 minutes, in addition to what Mike shared with us, you're certainly welcome to do that. We're close to our official ending time. Betty Sinowitz?
I just wondered whether what role Jews played as conscientious objectors in these 3 wars.
Mike, that's a
yeah. I really don't know much about that for these 3 wars. Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm sure there's some. I don't know the status of, particularly going back to the Civil War, what got you out of being drafted. Yeah, so it's a good question. That comes up a lot more.
Comes up
in
later on in
years.
Vietnam.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Anyone else? You have Mike's contact information.